Hi, I'm Ashley Hammond.
And I'm Locke Hammond.
We're married.
We run a business together.
And we homeschool our 4 kids.
That makes us sound a little crazy.
I think people might think we're a little crazy.
Well, through all that crazy, we're here to help you blaze your own trail through a world designed for conformity.
And break the chains holding you back from living an uncommon life.
This is Trailblazers and Chainbreakers. So we thought we knew what we were talking about when we came on here, and then we started talking about it and realized that we didn't really know how we were going to have that conversation. So we opted for a slightly different topic. So we're just going to kind of flip the script a little bit on this. I'm going to read you a quote, a tweet. I think it was a tweet. I don't know. I have it written down, saved on my phone, and it really hit home. And I want to get your take on it. I have a take on it. I have all kinds of questions about this. But here's what it says. When we avoid hard conversations, we're not keeping the peace. We are just keeping the tension. What's your immediate reaction to that?
Absolutely. I know for me, I love languages, quality time, but with that also is conversations. And I happen to be a very deep person already. Like I'm just a deep thinker. I'm just a deep person. I like deep conversation. That's like my thing. And I also am a verbal processor. So add all those things together in communication and conversations and having like hard conversations is how, I don't know, it's really important to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, conversations in general is important to you. I'm laughing because it makes me think of that statistic, or I don't know if it's a statistic that's quoted often, and I've been corrected by the internet police that this actually isn't true, but it's worth sharing anyways, that the average man says 7,000 words a day and the average woman says 20,000 words a day. So I was just laughing about that. I don't know if it's true. It sounds about right.
Yeah.
I know there are probably fluctuations. Some men talk a lot more, some women talk a lot less, for sure. You definitely talk more than I do, although when you get me going on something good, I can go with the best of them. But if you hear me chuckling, that's why I'm chuckling. I think communication, talking, conversation is definitely important to you in general. And you related it to love language, which was interesting because that's an interesting wrinkle that I've never considered until now, that it is a form of my love to you to work things out through conversation. And that's really interesting to me because the way I work things out is through contemplation and silence. Mm-hmm. So I will go, the most effective thing for me after let's say we get into it. I forget what night it was. We got into it maybe last Monday. I don't know. And you went upstairs, came back down to say goodnight to me. And I was frustrated, but I was journaling. Like that's how I process. I will journal, I will complain, I will vent, I will whine, and then I will eventually get around to how do I fix this? What do I need to take accountability for? What do I need to do differently? But that's how I process. And so similar to what we talked about with love languages, this is really, I don't know, this actually just opened my eyes, right? We're like 3 minutes in. I need to treat it as love language, kind of similar to love languages where acts of service and quality time are your love languages. They are not mine. They are like a foreign language to me. And so if I'm going to go do the dishes to, make love to you, to love you in your love language, I also need to consider that even though I process internally, written, silent, I need to love you through either sharing that with you after I'm done so that we can process together, or trying to process with you verbally. Never really considered that. So I'm glad you related that to love languages.
Yeah, 100%. I think for me, it sounds so silly too, but when I feel not a part of what is going on in your mind, which I know happens with a lot of men, but for me, especially just being a verbal processor and also quality time being very high for me, I feel disconnected.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times in our men's groups, the guys are talking about, and I think it might've been, if I'm misattributing this, I apologize, but I think it was David Data who originally I heard it from him, this idea that women want to be part of their man's mission. They don't want to be the mission. So like the mission to fix them or save them or like his only focus, like that doesn't do it for her. She wants him focused on something big and important, and she doesn't want to be left out. She doesn't want to be the driver. He's the driver, but she wants to be along for the ride.
Yes.
Probably providing value, helping, being included in the conversations, the decisions, right? And that's an interesting piece to tie into what you just said, which is it's important to you to be involved in what the heck is going on in my head.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, there's, like I said, there's a lot going on in my head. It's usually kept to myself. Occasionally I'll share it with you when the kids aren't screaming for our attention and we have a quiet minute, but oftentimes I keep it all to myself.
Yeah, which I think is backfiring because it's like, I can see, I know, I'm not dumb, and I'm very observant and perceptive, and it's just like, I want to talk. Like, that's what I want to do. And I don't expect, I'm not needy. I don't need to know everything. Like, did you have coffee this morning? What'd you have in it? What did you eat? Like, I don't need to know the silly stuff. I want to be a part of the big stuff.
Eggs, toast, sausage, and black.
So, yeah, I just want to be a part of the big stuff and know what's going on with Locke. And I think that's absolutely correct. Like, along for the ride, and a lot of the times I don't always feel like I'm along for the ride. I kind of just feel like I'm hanging out, and then sometimes I'm a part of it.
Yeah, good stuff. This is a timely topic, I think, because some of our conversations lately we've been frustrated with each other. I don't want to say we've been fighting or having. I mean, it feels like we haven't been communicating well, but I have an interesting perspective on this. I think we've shared our history a little bit on some of these episodes, but really quickly, like the way we would normally process stuff is kind of how we already explained, but I would keep things inside until I exploded on you. You would generally kind of drop low-key hints here and there, sometimes passive aggressive, sometimes perfectly appropriate. And I would kind of bite my tongue until I just got sick of it. And then we'd, kind of fight. And then in a fight, everything would come out for you and you dump it on me. Everything would come out for me and I dump it on you. We're in an interesting place lately where we were just talking before we started. It feels like we're struggling with our communication the past couple of weeks. But what I noticed in a good way is we've actually been able to hang on through some conversations that get a little contentious, that get a little heated, without really losing our cool. And that's not completely new, but that's something that we've worked really hard to develop over the years. We're actually able to get into a disagreement and last longer than 3 seconds without throwing a temper tantrum towards the other person. And so I think that leads to some frustration where like you're trying to convince me of something and I don't agree, and you feel like you're beating your head against the wall and it's triggering some old patterns and it's becoming a really hard conversation. And it feels like we have this communication block, but we never actually got to that part of the conversation before.
Yeah.
We've always just like shut it down, start screaming at each other, or, you leave and the conversation's over and, I never bring it back up or something like that. So it's interesting that we're still working through this and it's a timely conversation because we are still struggling to have some of these conversations and fully get through them. But I know I have a lot of fears about hard conversations in a relationship or in general, hard conversations with anyone in general. And I know a lot where that comes from. We've talked about some of this in the past, but what are your fears in having hard conversations with me, maybe in general, or specifically, my reactions? I'll share some of mine, but what holds you back from having a hard conversation? If we go back to that original quote.
There's so much I want to say right now. I heard something about like, why are they hard conversations anyway? Because you got to think about the topics that bring out arguments in your relationship. And I mean, Some of them are just stuff from like past resentments and stuff, but then some of them are like very basic, people would call hard conversations in marriage, like sex, money. Why are they hard? And you think about it, they're like, why are these conversations considered hard? Like, these are like ongoing life stuff that happens. Like, it is, sex is a part of our life. Money is a part of our life. Like, it's going to forever be. Why does it have to be labeled as a hard conversation? And I'm like, well, duh. Like, how did your parents talk about those things? How was those things talked to you when you were a kid? Like, did you talk about money? Did you know anything about money when you were a kid? Did you see the way your parents talked about money or fought about money? Sex, like, were your parents loving? Did you like, and these things became hard conversations because of our upbringing and how it was either shown through us or not talked to through us. But these conversations actually don't have to be hard, but we have so much baggage behind them from our upbringing.
I mean, yeah, that's the essence of this quote, right? When we avoid hard conversations. So when we avoid talking about money, we're not keeping the peace. We're just keeping the tension about money.
Yeah.
And I think, I think I cut you off a little bit there, but like 100%, this is stemming from our upbringing, but it's also our patterns. If I look at our marriage, our patterns in our early years came from obviously what we learned, what we saw, what we always did. We built those patterns, but they're like self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
So these are hard conversations because our parents didn't model them, but also these are like, let's talk about money. Money is hard conversation for us because we really screwed it up for years in the beginning of our relationship. Sex is a hard conversation for us sometimes because we got into some fights, back to like biting your tongue until you get resentful, letting the resentment build up until you can't control it. And then you say something like a total dick. I say something like a total dick and you get really offended and it triggers all kinds of wounds in you. And then it's just that much harder of a conversation.
Yeah. So I'll actually answer your question now.
Yeah, cool. What are your fears? What are your hesitations? What keeps you from those conversations?
Past reactions.
Yeah.
Also present reactions, because although we show up much better than we did, we still are human and we still revert back to past patterns and the way we show up. So like for me, it's fear. It's remembering having these conversations in the past and how they went. But also there has been times in the present where these conversations haven't gone well. And also, you said this in the beginning, I'm better at bringing up the hard conversations.
Yep.
Doesn't mean that it's easy for me. It's actually really hard for me. And I want to have these conversations much more than we do. And I want to get on like a habit of having these conversations. But I feel like constantly pushing myself is really hard because I have that fear. But then I get resentful because I'm like, why do I have to bring up these conversations most of the time? And like, I don't want to have these conversations either, but I know I love you more than not having those conversations.
Yeah.
So our marriage and you mean more to me than the discomfort. And so then I'm like, why doesn't this matter to him?
Yeah. Well, so I'm glad you phrased that question and not at all from an insulting perspective, but that question is a beautiful one that probably half the people listening to or more were just like, oh yeah, that's exactly how I feel. That question is asked entirely from your perspective.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is I'll tell you exactly why I struggle with these conversations, but I'm struggling with these conversations for my reasons, and I'm not failing to bring them up because it's not important to me. In fact, I'm falling more into the camp of like the beginning of this quote, when we avoid the hard conversations, we're not keeping the peace. I feel like it's safer not to bring it up because when we bring it up, and I'll go into some of the reasons in a second. When I bring it up, we're going to get in a fight and it's going to upset you. It's going to upset me. It's going to damage our relationship. And so because I love you, I'm not going to bring it up. Yeah. And it's the exact, you can poke all kinds of holes in that reasoning and I will be the first one to do so in 2 minutes, but it's not because I don't care. It's actually because I do care.
Yeah.
And so if the people who feel like their partner is not having hard conversations and why don't they care enough to have these conversations, I would ask you to take a minute or two and actually try to look at it from their perspective, his or her perspective, and say, well, they certainly aren't bringing them up. That is probably true. Are they not bringing it up because of the same reason that I want them to bring it up? And then if that's true, like it is in our case, it makes it way easier for you to handle the fact that I'm not bringing it up. It gives you a whole different understanding to come into the conversations with, instead of resentment that you have to bring this up again, or that I haven't brought it up, or whatever it is. It allows you to understand where I'm coming from and have some empathy, some sympathy, whatever you want to call it. Because I'm not refusing to bring them up because I don't care. I care enough that, one of my big fears is that I've screwed these conversations up so many times in the past, mainly because I held it in until it exploded out and I was a total dick. I handled them so poorly in the past that I don't trust myself to handle them well.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hurt you. And when I try to bring something up and I think that I do a good job, but I trip over an unseen wound, or I phrase something wrong, or I time it wrong, and I genuinely was trying. I was doing something that's hard for me, bringing up a hard conversation. I was doing it because I know it's important to you, because I love you. And I thought I was doing it right, but I made a mistake, or I just, maybe I didn't do anything wrong and it was just the wrong time. And you get hurt. It's like 10 times worse than if I just breezed in, was a total dick. In hindsight, can see how I screwed it up. Like, there are times where I'm analyzing, I'm like, what did I do wrong? I'm like, I didn't do anything wrong. It's like, well, why the hell did this go badly? And I feel like helpless in hurting you in those situations. And so that's one of my fears. One of the reasons I struggle to bring stuff up is I'm afraid that I'm going to handle it poorly. And one that's kind of on the flip side of that is another fear, another hesitation to bringing it up is I've shared in the past, like abandonment wound stuff, right? So one of the fears that gets me is, I don't know if it's shame or embarrassment, or like a fear that I'm going to disappoint you to the point of being unlovable, right? So if I let's say I'm unsatisfied with something. One of the things we were just talking about before this, you're bringing up love languages. So one of my love languages is physical touch. If I feel like, you haven't touched me in a long time, you are usually amazing at like rubbing my neck, holding my hand, rubbing my hand. If I feel like you haven't done that in a while and I bring that up and that offends you, or it makes you feel like you're a failure or whatever it is, it disappoints you that it's not good enough for me, like I'm high maintenance or whatever it is, that's a real fear that's going to feed right into my abandonment wound, like drive you away.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are a couple fears. The other one that I think we gotta address, because it's usually present, is, and this is true for me, one of the reasons why I don't like to bring this stuff up, why I don't like when you bring it up. One of the easiest ways to guarantee that these conversations go sideways is if I react in this certain way when you bring something up. And it's like, I don't actually roll my eyes, but it's kind of like the eye roll, my body tenses up, here we go again attitude.
Yeah.
And that stems from some semblance of reality in that you are very verbal about the things that bother you, and some kind of fear-based creation in my mind playing that up bigger than it is. But I oftentimes will get really tense around these subjects. And when I get like physically, like you'll bring up money and I will feel myself physically tense up and have that kind of eye roll, like I don't want to talk about this. Sometimes I'll physically cross my arms and my legs or something if we're sitting. That's pretty much guaranteed to screw the conversation.
Yeah.
But B, that comes from somewhere. And if there's been a history, so you said one of your fears or one of the things holding you back is past reactions. If there's been a history of, I hesitate to use this word, but this will probably be the most common word, like nagging from one party to the other, criticizing, complaining, a lot of kind of, I guess complaining is the best word. that might be present in a lot of relationships. So, and it certainly doesn't go one way or the other. You and I have both done that to each other on lots of different topics where it's like everything out of my mouth is negative about this and vice versa. So I do think that that's worth acknowledging, because when there's just this past history of constant, whether you want to call it nagging, criticizing, complaining, shaming, you have to overcome that to be able to have these hard conversations.
Well, do you think that the nagging, because you said that a lot of times you don't want to say things or you don't want to have the hard conversations because you don't want to hurt me. And so there's a fear of hurting me. But there's also, so for me, I can come in hot for things just because of previous conversations. Like, I have a very strong personality. You also said it's a personality thing with me being able to have these conversations more than you. I had to fend for myself. I was an only child. And I always had a fire in me that like stuck up for myself. Maybe not completely, but as I got older, where like if I felt safe with you, like I was going to have tough conversations and stand up for myself and the people that I love. So for me, I don't always come at it at the greatest angle. I can come in hot. But also, do you think that the nitpicking and nagging is what causes avoidance in you? Because I think a lot of times not having these conversations, they need to be had, or even things that are bothering one of us or the other. But there's like, these conversations need to be had. It's bothering you too, but you'll avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the cop-out answer would be to blame you. And I wonder how many people listening to that question relating to the feeling of being nagged a lot or criticized a lot immediately jumped on hell yeah as their answer. I think that if we're going to be 100% honest and accountable with ourselves in my specific situation, and I bet most of the people that really answered affirmatively to that question, the reality is no.
Yeah.
My avoidance tendencies were there before you.
Yeah. Before
I ever met you. It doesn't help. Like if I don't want to use the word nagging because you don't nag me. But if you're consistently complaining, criticizing, finding fault, that's not going to make it better. That's going to make it worse. But I had the avoidance tendency before I met you. And I think we've talked about this on previous episodes too. You are perfectly designed to activate all of my worst flaws and worst wounds. And the same is true for me, for you. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons that I was attracted to you, and I didn't know this, was exactly that, right? We've talked about our fighting habits, right? So we get in a disagreement. Your habit is to run away. That's your trauma response. It's what kept you alive at one point. So you physically leave. You usually go upstairs to the bedroom. That is my deepest wound, my abandonment wound. You're physically leaving. You're not leaving the house even, but it feels like you're leaving me. And I feel like I'm going to die. So I pursue and I say, okay, let's fix this. Not necessarily the worst idea, but it's not good timing because I'm not in a place to be able to fix it. Neither are you. That's my trauma response. Let me fix this so that I don't lose you. It's perfectly matched to your deepest wound, which is when you need to flee. If someone pursues you, you are backed into a corner and you will fight to the death. That's what kept you alive. So it just spirals us deeper and deeper into our conditioning, our wounds. In this sense, like subconsciously on some level, I think we are supposed to fix these flaws in ourselves, right? Regardless of your spiritual beliefs, wherever you think you came from, like we are supposed to grow in this life and fix our flaws. You being critical, finding fault, complaining, whatever it is perfectly matched to my avoidance. And it plays it up in some situations, but that's the exact opposite of what I'm supposed to be doing. Like I've been thrown into the fire to fix this problem and it's my choice whether I do or not. And I'm sure it's vice versa. Like you find that avoidance probably infuriating.
It's one of my biggest.
Right. And so the flip side question is like, well, what are you meant to learn and grow out of in that situation? Because if you're perfectly designed to trigger me in my flaws and my wounds, I am likewise back to you in that exact situation that's triggering me. is triggering you,
Yeah.
what's the point? What's the message? What's the lesson? So good question. Short answer, it makes it worse, but absolutely is not the cause.
Yeah. It's interesting about the avoidance too, because I was just thinking about it's one of my biggest, I don't like to say hate,
Frustrations.
but it's one of my biggest frustrations. I hate,
You hate to say
loathe.
hate.
I hate, loathe it. It brings out a lot of, for me, childhood wounds. I grew up with somebody close that was very avoidant of things, and actually both the people that I grew up with. So
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask about, you know me, I'm getting into practical, like, what do we do about this stuff? Before I do that, I just want to point out, if these conversations, if there's certain conversations that are always fights, forcing them isn't good. So like the quote says, when we avoid hard conversations, we're not keeping the peace, we're keeping the tension. But if you try and force hard conversations and you're both unable to change in your reactions and it's just guaranteed to be a fight, that's even worse, because now it's not just resentment, it's open conflict. So there are some things to do about that. And one of the resources that I would recommend, I was just flipping through this book. You and I read this book together. I think you did the audiobook. It's a John Gottman book. I think it's the 7, oh boy, I'm blanking on the title all of a sudden.
Remember.
The 7 somethings of making marriage work, the 7 keys, the 7 principles of making marriage work, something like that. And Dr. John Gottman, highly recommend it. You and I read that together. You did the audiobook. I did the physical book, because audio, physical, obviously. Explained that already. And we did a chapter a week for a long time. And then we'd sit down on, I think it was Monday nights, whatever night of the week, and talk about it. So anyways, there's a chapter in that on what he calls gridlock, which is these conversations that always result in gridlock or fight or whatever it is. Highly recommend the book as a whole. Also, that chapter, I just reread that this past week, is very helpful, very enlightening. But let's talk about us specifically, and we can also talk generally. But how do you, Ashley, like, how do you need to soften yourself? What do you need to do for yourself to make it easier for me to have these conversations, to welcome these conversations? Or if we're in one, what do you have to stop yourself from doing, or make sure you do, to make it continue along good lines and not spiral out of control?
Well, I have to first check with myself to make sure I'm in a place to have that conversation, because I'm an emotional being. I'm a woman. And if you're offended by that, if you're a woman, we are emotional beings. That's what we are. And I am, and I'm up and down and all around. I don't think all women are like that. There are some women that are a little bit more steady in their mood, but I happen to be one that's up and down and all around. I need to check with myself and make sure that, like, although this conversation is pressing, can it wait like till next week? Maybe I'm not in a place to have that discussion. I don't think I do that enough. And I think sometimes I'm just annoyed and I'll just want to have the conversation because I can procrastinate. Like, I do procrastinate and I don't want to have the conversation. So sometimes, like, if I don't have it now, then I won't have it. And then it will just irritate me. But I think also if it's that important to me, then I need to make it happen when the time is right. I think also for me is not attacking your character and who you are.
Yeah.
And coming at it from like, I feel like, versus like you always, or you never, or whatever I'm using, the language that I'm using. I know it's silly and people talk about language all the time, but
That's
I think
not silly at all.
I think language is very important. And Locke did mention he's words of affirmation. So it's even more important that I don't come at it as attacking him and his character, because then he feels shame and guilt. And I know that he already feels that. And he doesn't need me adding to that.
Yeah.
It's just setting up the conversation for failure. It's just from the beginning going to go downhill. And I think sometimes I have good intentions in the beginning and I start off good, but something will happen in between where I'll
Yeah, you say good intentions, and you do have good intentions, but the word I want to focus on is intention. So slightly different than good intentions, but coming into the conversation intentionally, I think is one of the things that has changed it for you, and also for me. So, but I think you're kind of making this point about intentionality. So I think, and I know this is true for me, and I think it's true for you. Correct me if I'm wrong. When you come into the conversation and you're aware of the fact that this is a hard conversation, this is a touchy subject, Locke might be a little bit defensive. I need to be careful of my language. Maybe I need to make sure we're sitting next to each other holding hands on the couch as opposed to across from the room.
Staring at each other.
Yeah, right. Which, interesting, complete side note. I forget where I heard this. Women like to communicate face to face, looking each other in the eye. Men prefer to communicate side by side, looking in the same direction.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of metaphorical things there from the guy's perspective. You know, we're both facing the same direction. We're on a mission. We have our eyes on the future kind of stuff, right? If we're face to face, it certainly feels much more confrontational to me but that's an important piece to understand. Like, you may want to have this conversation face to face, looking each other in the eye, but if it's going to, what's your ultimate goal? Success in the conversation, or doing it the way you want to do it?
Yeah.
So if I need you to, or if you know that that's a touchy subject for me and you're like, well, one way I can make it seem less confrontational is sitting next to each other on the couch, not making eye contact, not in an awkward way, but like we're just looking this way. Once in a while, we may glance at each other. Complete side note.
I do have something to say about that, though.
Okay, go ahead.
They do say this is related to kids, but I have a friend who said this worked well with her husband, the side to side thing. They say if you want to have a really good conversation with your kid, if you see something is bothering them, take them for a car ride or take them for a walk. I do that with different kids individually, and I have some of the best conversations. But I also had a friend that has a hard time having hard conversations with her husband, and she said she goes for walks with him and they have some of the best conversations. So there's something to that.
Well, years ago, every Monday morning, we would go for coffee. We'd get a coffee and we'd drive around because we had two young kids who came kind of back to back, less than 2 years apart. So like driving that kid that we couldn't leave with my mom, who had the other kids because, she had to breastfeed.
Yeah.
Would keep the kid asleep so we could talk.
Yeah.
So driving in the car, we had some of the best conversations we've ever had doing that. So that's an interesting point too. But I think I was talking about intentionality.
You were.
I got sidetracked.
We both got sidetracked.
So coming in intentionally, obviously with good intentions, but I mean like with the understanding of how you need to show up, how I need you to show up, how I might be defensive, and to not take that personally. I think that's huge. And when we spiral out of these conversations, I think from my perspective, when I cause the spiral, it is 100% always because I lose sight of that intentionality and I get sucked into reacting, whether it's defensively or angrily or whatever it may be. I get stuck in my perspective instead of keeping both of our perspectives in mind. Basically, I lose sight of that goal. And I lose sight of the question of what's the desired outcome of this conversation. Do you want to have a good conversation, or do you want to just spew all the things that have been on your mind?
Yeah.
And I start spewing all the things that are on my mind. So I think intentionality is a huge key in having these conversations, remembering that you may need to use kid gloves, to use that expression, with your partner to have this conversation. And a lot of people get stuck on that idea of like, oh, I shouldn't have to. That's one of the phrases. I'm going to use hate because I know you hate. I hate the phrase I shouldn't have to, and then fill in whatever the blank is. Like, I shouldn't have to tell my wife what I want. I shouldn't have to handle this conversation delicately. It's like, yeah, you should.
Yeah.
And do you want to? No. And that's fine. But like, I should have to come in with intentionality to have a hard conversation with you. Otherwise, why would it go well?
Yeah.
I shouldn't always have to be the one that brings it up. Like, I can go on all day about that.
Well, what's beautiful and what you're really good at, and I'm trying to get better at, is you've always been, and I will say always, an out of the box thinker. Your brain you have this box and you're able to think out of that box really well. And you used to get mad at me a lot for, and you probably still do, is like, Ashley, what is the end result? Like, what do you want out of this? Like, you're saying all this stuff, all these things you don't want. Like, what do you want? I think intentionality, what you're saying, we're going into this hard conversation. We know we both are uncomfortable. what do we want out of this conversation? What is the end result?
Yeah.
And like, instead of like getting sidetracked on a million different things that we don't want or that we don't like. And I have a really hard time with that, but you're really good at that. So most likely there's going to be someone in the relationship that's better at that.
Yep.
And I think setting that up for success is being like, okay, this is what we both want from this. Let's not get sidetracked on all the things that piss us off or that we don't want. And like, what are we going to do to make it better?
Yeah. Great point. I think coming into a conversation knowing what you don't want is really easy. It's way easier to know what you don't want than what you do want. And I've lost track of the number of guys that I've talked to, either in groups or one-on-one, that talk about the frustration of their partner. And I'm not saying this is a woman thing. I'm just saying I don't talk to the wives. I talk to the guys that have expressed frustration in their partner knowing what they don't want, but when they're asked what they do want, being unable to identify that.
Oh yeah, I can relate to that 100%. It's really, really hard for me. And this also goes with the way I process though too. But it's really hard for me to be like, I don't know, but like I know that none of this is working.
Yeah.
Like this isn't working for me.
Let me use this story, and I find this story amusing, so I hope you find the story amusing because it's about you. To highlight the how frustrating this can be, and how unhelpful this can be. So years ago, before we even moved to this house, old house we were living in, I don't even remember what the dishes were. We had bought new dishes, or they were given to us, or I don't know what they were. And they were on the counter. And I remember you coming into the kitchen and saying something like, I think I had washed them and they were dry, and I stacked them or set them what I thought was nicely. Maybe it wasn't nicely, but I had stacked them and set them kind of out of the way. And you came in the kitchen and you're like, in your defense, using your words pretty nicely, but you're like, hey, honey, can we just not leave dishes left on the counter? Can we put them away, please? And I was like, I looked at it and I was like, yeah. I mean, right. So saying what you don't want, you don't want them left out on the counter. And I looked at him and I was like, yeah, of course. Where do they go? They're new dishes. Where do you want them? And you looked at him and you're like, I don't know. And I was like, okay, well, you know what you didn't want. You don't want them left out. And I'm trying to solve this problem for you, but you can't tell me where you do want them. So like, they're left out.
Yeah.
And like, silly little story, but that is the uselessness of coming into a conversation only knowing what you don't want.
Yeah.
You can't come to a solution. It just feels like a bitch fest if you can't come to a solution. Yeah.
And this is where the work comes in. There needs to be a lot more reflection done before a conversation to figure out what the heck it is you do want. And I still think that the conversation might be tough, even if you do figure this out. I'm just not naturally an out of the box thinker. And that doesn't come natural for me. And sometimes I do need to talk it out. This is the tough part though. Sometimes I do need to talk it out to figure it out what I do want. Like I know all these things that I don't want, but sometimes I do need to have that conversation with you for me to process and be like, to figure out what it is that I do want. And that's where it's tough because every personality, every body is different. But for me, and I don't know if anyone can relate to this, I actually do need to have the conversation of all the things that I don't want to be able to figure out what it is that I do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's important for me to understand. It's important for you to understand because then you can say something like, if my answer is very practical and solution oriented and be like, okay, well, how do we solve this? And you're like, I have no freaking clue. Instead of me being, just frustrated, throwing my hands up and being like, well, what the hell are we talking about this for? Then you can say, you can soften your approach because you know that is tough.
Yeah.
And you can say like, I want to find the solution. I just need to talk through a couple things and maybe we can get there together. Like that's a very different approach than I don't want the dishes on the counter. I have no clue where to put them. Just get them off the counter. And getting defensive because you're caught in a situation where you don't know what you want. A lot of times in the conversations that I hear about, and we've done this too, is when it's like, okay, well, you don't want this. That's great. What do you want? What do you want me to do about it? And you don't have a good answer. It's very easy for you to get defensive. Not just you, Ashley, but anyone, the royal you. If you're not aware of that tendency to get defensive in a moment where you can't answer the question of like, well, what do you want? There goes a whole conversation. That whole conversation goes sideways. So,
Yeah.
all right. A couple of things. So the question was, how do you need to soften? What do you need to do to make these conversations easier? Did you have anything else, or you want to hear my answer?
No, I can hear yours.
Cool. The first is probably, I think I already mentioned this. I would use the word unclench. Physically, like, I don't know if you've noticed this. I've noticed this, which has been interesting to kind of become aware of. Physically tensing up on certain subjects. Or when you bring things up in a certain way, that's a pretty good one. Certain phrases. So like the stereotypical, like, hey, we need to talk. You don't say that, but it's kind of like that. You have phrases where it's like, usually in the past, this has been a bad way to start a conversation. Like to the point of like, sometimes when you call me, if I'm off working, sometimes you'll call me and you know me. So you've learned to say this, but you kind of have to sometimes start conversations with, hey, nothing's wrong. Like, I just need to ask you something. Because my immediate reaction is like, oh, one of the kids fell out of a chair and needs to get stitches or something like that. So, but yeah, personally, I need to be aware of that tendency to set us and myself up for failure by the way my physical body is. And the way your physical body is unbelievably important. If you're crossing your arms, if you're crossing your legs, that is a sign subconsciously to the other person that you are not receptive to this conversation. And it also manifests itself in the way you act. So if you're not aware that you're doing it, it's still causing you to be unreceptive to the conversation. So that's one piece. I think that for me, it's been helpful we've done a whole podcast on this, and maybe we should revisit this because I still think it's not as well understood or talked about with guys as it should be. But guys tracking their wives' cycle, for me, knowing where you are in your cycle, and it's not just about your period and whether you're on your period or not, like there's much more fluctuation besides that.
Yeah.
But understanding where you are helps me understand whether the piece that you are talking about is what is actually the problem. And what I mean by that is, perfect example would be like in certain situations. So this is kind of unrelated to hard topics, but hard conversations, but there are certain situations where, if I know you're going out and you have to do something uncomfortable, like let's say you're going to like a networking kind of community group kind of thing, not my strong suit for sure, not something that makes you feel super comfortable, you may be a little bit nervous going into that situation. If you get into it with one of our kids 5 minutes before you go out the door, I can pretty confidently think to myself, this is not about the socks that were left on the floor. The real issue is how she's feeling right now. And that's not belittling how you're feeling or the things that bother you at all. But I can, instead of getting into a conversation with you in the moment about socks on the floor, I know that maybe I need to hug you, have a conversation about how you're feeling, something along those lines. And so there are undoubtedly times in a woman's cycle, and you kind of mentioned this already, I think, where it's more likely that you're going to be finding flaws, finding issues, finding things that upset you. And so if I know you're in that part of the cycle, it's a lot easier for me to take something with a grain of salt and be like, okay, well, I'm going to give her 10 minutes. And then if she's still upset about this, we can have a conversation. But I know from past experience that maybe she's just having a moment and needs a hug, kind of situation. So that's been helpful for me, mostly because it puts a kind of a scientific system behind my need to not take things so personally. I also think the last thing on my list is just like having scheduled times to talk about these things, whether that's like a recurring meeting, relationship review is what we call them sometimes, or therapy. I've been talking to a couple guys who have experienced this idea that having a standing meeting or having even like a third party mediated meeting, which would be therapy or counseling, gives them the ability to come into these conversations more responsibly, I'll say. knowing that someone else is watching, or knowing that they can, even if it's not therapy or counseling, even if it's just you and your husband or your wife, knowing that you have a scheduled time to discuss some of these things allows you to save them for later, which in my experience, when I save things for later, I would say that 9 times out of 10, the things that I'm angry about and I want to tell you I'm angry about in the moment, 9 times out of 10, when I wait 2 days till we have our conversation, they don't even need to be brought up. The vast majority of them are not things that need to be had a difficult conversation about, which the 1 out of 10 that is important to have a difficult conversation about, that frees up our bandwidth and our, it means that we're not constantly having these hard conversations. If you only have them once a week instead of every single day, it's probably going to go a little bit better than if you try and have them every single day.
Yeah.
So those are things that kind of came to my mind in terms of making these conversations easier. You got anything else on that?
I just think reflection is huge. I think that, I don't know, this is going on your point, but I think reflection is huge. And if you can't have the conversations, like the tough conversations that you and your partner have a tough time talking about, maybe reflecting together on why it's tough for you guys to talk about that. And also, if you can, when you set an attention for a conversation and you know what the outcome is, maybe try to tell yourself or tell your partner that, like, I'm not the person that I was. Like, because I think that the clenching and the resistance, and then there's a lot of the past that is in that. There's the past of things in the way that they have happened before that comes into that conversation, that sets that conversation up for failure. Because of just the way that you've acted in the past about something or this specific topic. And that is like, it's almost gonna fail if you go into it from a failure mindset. It's just like not having any intention on the outcome. Like if you think the outcome is going to be bad, well, then it's going to be bad because you've already, like you said, I used to come into conversations already expecting you to react a certain way that, like, I set you up
and then you created the reaction. Yeah.
I do strongly believe, and some people might think that's woo-woo or stupid. No, it's absolutely correct. And when I reflected on after he said that to me, it's like, he's right. Like I went in like hot, like I'm going to have this conversation and I don't really care what he thinks. And like, I set him up to fail. Like I didn't handle it well. I didn't voice what I was feeling well. And it was just like, I'm just going to say what I need to say. And like, I don't really care because it just needs to be said. And it's like, that didn't end well because of the way that you set that up.
Yeah.
But I think also like, there's a question to be asked, like, what if you are being intentional? What if you are reflecting and these conversations still aren't being had? What do you do then? What if they're still being avoided?
Well, I'll give you an answer that's hard for me to that I don't like hearing, I think is the best way to put it. Sometimes you need help.
Yeah.
My number one place to turn for help is always been books. I think that's a good place to turn, but sometimes you need more than that. I just referenced therapy or counseling, coaching. Sometimes that help can be structure. Back to my point about having a scheduled meeting. We talk about relationship reviews. We've done a podcast episode on that where we list off a bunch of questions we use in that, how to do that, how to screw it up, because we've done that plenty. So like a scheduled time to have these conversations, a system could be a form of help. So a structure or a system on how to have these conversations. I think ultimately, if it's not, what's the expression? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, right? So if you're trying and you're doing the things you think you're supposed to be doing and you're still not making any progress, then you need outside opinion and perspective, whether that's, book, counselor, coach, friend, mentor, whatever. And I do think, kind of in closing, one of my last thoughts is, I think the one ingredient that is mandatory in being able to have these difficult conversations is humility, and being able to come in and basically own the things that you've screwed up in the past. You and I have talked in this episode about so many things that we've screwed up. If you can't own those things, then you can't move past them. The flip side of that is, so let me say, like, if I can't own my mistakes, we can't move past them. The flip side of that is, if you can't, I'm not saying you have to forgive them immediately, right? But if you can't at least have a civil back and forth around those mistakes, instead of, you said, I think, criticizing and throwing like the always and the never and attacking my character, call that character assassination. If you can't at least have a conversation around my past mistakes without just like flying off into a rage, same thing. We're never going to get past it.
Yeah.
You don't have to forgive me right this second, but if I come to you and I'm like, listen, I've messed this up in the past. I've messed up these hard conversations or conversations about money. I want to do better going forward. And I have a couple ideas on how to do better. Can you work on this with me? If your response is then to bring up all the things that I've screwed up and get really angry about it, like, of course, we're not going to be able to have these hard conversations.
Yeah.
So I think actually having a hard conversation about hard conversations is probably the first conversation to have.
Sounds crazy, but I think so too.
Yeah. Sit down, this podcast episode, sit down and listen to this with your spouse, send this to your spouse, listen to it separately, and then come back together and talk about it.
That's some of our best conversations we've had, is actually listening to a podcast
yeah.
and having a conversation about it, but also reading a book together.
Yeah.
And having a conversation about it.
Yeah. Interesting. When we would drive around, sometimes when we didn't feel like talking, we were just talking about the conversations we had in the car driving around. The best way to start those best conversations was with a podcast. And then we would pause it in the middle of it and we would go on a tangent for 20 minutes about what we just heard. And then we'd be like, you done? I'm done. You done? And then we'd go back to the podcast. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'd highly recommend that book by Dr. John Gottman. Obviously, I highly recommend this podcast. So share this with your spouse. That's all I got. Anything you want to throw out on top of that?
No, I'm good.
No, that's it. You are good. All right. Thank you guys for coming along on the journey with us.
Thanks, friends. Hi, friends. If you're enjoying the show, would you please leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcasts for us? Doing this helps more people find the podcast, which means even more people can benefit from the conversations. We really appreciate you and your time, and thanks, as always, for listening.